Thank you for joining us, and we are recording today, so thank you for watching for our Tools for the Creative Life presentation about art and accessibility. We are really excited for today's panel. Before we kick things off, I'd love to read a brief land acknowledgement because we are here in person today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we live, work, and create on is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We intentionally recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and all of those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We recognize that government, academic, and cultural institutions were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We also recognize that much of our nation was built by the hands and on the backs of enslaved Africans and Indigenous peoples. We stand in awe of their resilience and creativity, and we express gratitude for and celebrate their past and ongoing contributions. We strive to never take for granted the privilege and complexity of living, working, and creating on this land, and intentionally honor Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in our city. We commit to cultural equity and strive to make this a safe and welcoming space where healing can occur, truths can be told, hidden stories unearthed, and legacies of oppression and inequity continually dismantled. Also, we are dedicated, this is from when we do it virtually about changing your pronouns, but we are happy to have our wonderful ASL interpreters with us today as well, again, in our commitment to inclusivity and accessibility. I'm Meredith Badler. I'm the Deputy Director of the Colorado Business Committee for the Arts. It's a mouthful. The CBCA. We are one of several partners that puts on the Tools for the Creative Life series. So I can invite my co-organizers to introduce themselves and their organizations as well.
Hi, I'm Allie Sharp. I am the Community Outreach Director for the RiNo Art District. Thank you for being here.
And I'm Jen Dewey. I'm from Denver Public Library, and if you don't have a library card, I brought some, and I will sign you up for one. And we are open now, so please come visit us. And we're so pleased to be part of this, and great to see all of you panelists, and thanks for being here today.
John Makowsky, Executive Director of Transforming Creatives. We invest in the health of creatives so they can invest in the health of society. And part of the work we do is we operate this creative workspace, Converge Denver. So welcome, glad you're here. Let me know if you need anything. There's restrooms right behind you, water over there. If you're watching this from home, I don't know where your restrooms and water are, but we're just thrilled you all are here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is a monthly series, so make sure you're following any of our organizations to hear about upcoming events. So now it is our pleasure to turn it over to our panel. Today, Damon, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead our conversation with our Nancy, Andrea, and Bridget.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Everyone, hello at home. Everyone here at Converge, thank you all for having us. My name is Damon McLeese. I'm the Executive Director of a group here in Denver called Access Gallery. And I'm really thrilled to be sitting here with three people that I've known for actually quite a while. I think Nancy, you and I might go back the furthest. But I am just so thrilled to see my friend Bridget. I haven't seen Bridget since, I think, LEAD conference a couple years ago. Well, no, maybe sometime after that. Andrea, I just can't keep up with you. So, for me, hosting or trying to moderate a panel of friends is clearly a challenge. But the work that all of us do in this area, I think, is really important to have a discussion about accessibility, about who's not still at the table very often. I love the land acknowledgement, and one thing that I always want to keep in mind that more recent history, Denver was very much a hotbed for disability rights, disability really changing the way that the country looks at disability and people with disabilities. There's actually a plaque at the corner of Broadway and Colfax where a group of people called the Gang of 19 were basically chaining themselves to the brand new RTD buses that were coming on as the new RTD fleet, and they were not accessible. So things have been very active here in Denver for a very, very long time. Denver and Berkeley, I like to think, we're a little ahead of Berkeley, but that's just because I'm a Colorado boy. We're not going to get into a whole competitive thing. But I would like to have my friends introduce themselves, and then we'll circle back around to some of the questions, if that's okay. And since I'm left-handed, I'm going to start on my left with Bridget.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone at home. My name is Bridget Heddens. I've also come across some of these guys, Andrea and Damon. I'm really glad to be here with you guys. I am a local artist. I'm also the co-founder of Beam Plus. And I started Beam Plus maybe 5 years ago with my friend Maya, who has Down syndrome. And ever since then, we've grown from just us two dancing in the studio together to now applying for grants, having a group of over 15 people, performing and making films, and kind of preaching the word of accessibility, especially in the dance world. This year we're also trying to expand to other art forms. So we've done some poetry and hoping to keep expanding. That's just a little bit about me.
And you're still up in Boulder? Or are you down there?
I'm in Denver, yeah.
Okay.
I'm in Aurora now.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. It's been a while. But I don't even know where you are. So. Andrea, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Andrea Moore, and I am a white woman. I'm wearing a multicolored shawl and black kind of bodysuit looking thing. I've got glasses on. I also, since this is a conversation about accessibility, I'll say that I identify as neurotypical and able-bodied. And I just want to say that out loud since we're talking about disability and inclusion. That I am part of this conversation from an ally perspective and not from having a lived identity. I am the co-founder and former executive director for a local Denver nonprofit called the Wayfaring Band. And we're not a rock and roll or a musical band, but a band of travelers. So it's a group of people with and without intellectual and developmental disabilities who band together and explore the world as peers. So to date, in the last 9 years, the Wayfaring Band has been on over 50 trips, spanning over, I think, 17 states and 5 countries. And we do work with a neurodiverse community, and so we've got folks with and without disabilities who come together all as paying clients, not a volunteer system, to discuss accessibility and ableism and inclusion and to explore the world. And yeah, I think that's it. And he says he can't keep up with me because I obviously travel is a big part of my life.
Yeah, well, recently, it's like every time I turned around, she was somewhere different. So
Yeah.
it's like, okay, now it's only between Denver and New Mexico.
Yeah, now with the pandemic, I'm not on airplanes, but I'm still driving in the car.
Yes. So, and Nancy?
Thank you, Damon. First off, I just want to thank everybody, especially for the land acknowledgement. As somebody from an indigenous background, originally from California, San Diego, that means a lot. I've lived here in Colorado for the last 25 years. 2 years I was in Denver, and then 23 years I've been in Loveland. And Damon, I've known you for many years, probably since I first moved to Colorado. I walked into the Access Gallery, and I was introduced to Damon by another deaf artist, Uzi, and he currently lives in Israel now. I am a visual artist. I travel all over the country to deaf schools and teach deaf students art. Once a year, I provide workshops related to accessibility for art teachers and developing an art curriculum specifically for deaf students in trying to understand their identities and who they are as a deaf person. I also do murals. I paint both outside and inside, specifically school buildings. I adorn their hallways with a number of different murals as well. And I'm currently working on children's books.
Well, and I think all three of our panelists are a little bit on the modest side, but let's see if we can pull a little bit more of that out. I do want to mention that we're showing some of Nancy's paintings of the children's books. I hope this is okay to say. We're going to be showing some of her work in the gallery in October.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yes, and she will be in our Inmate Pieces of Art show September 17th, which is 2 weeks away. I know that. So let's just, since it's a small group.
Oh, I thought it was October. It's September, okay.
My heart literally just stopped there. Oh, but then I realized she's already sent her piece in, so I'm okay. We're all good on that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so really, I want to sort of dive into the word accessibility because I know it means different things to different people in different contexts. And I've always thought that it was a very interesting concept, a lot of times just based on your perception. You know, Andrea, you and I very much identify as allies. We've always been in that ally role. And I often talk about the fact that what's accessible for one person may not be so accessible to another person. Or what's accessible for one group may not be at all accessible to another group. And I'd really like to just sort of unpack that a little bit. And I'm not going to keep picking on Bridget, so whoever might want to start with that, can we dive into that? The idea, just the general concept of what accessibility might mean to you as an artist, as a person, as a whatever. Okay, Bridget.
I kind of reflected on this question, and I think accessibility is within Beam Plus and what we've come up with for Beam Plus and talked about with the participants and dancers of my group, is it just really comes down to like belonging for me. I've seen a lot of organizations I've worked with in the past kind of make the effort with some check boxes, but if there's not a sense of belonging in your space, then I don't think it's truly accessible. So with Beam, we've tried to have that open conversation with our dancers, with our artists, to find out what they need, and not just our artists with disabilities, but our artists without, because we have a really diverse group of people coming together to work together, and everyone needs something different, especially in a dance setting or just an art setting. So I think belonging is really key for me and what I'm doing right now.
You want me to go? Or you want to?
Oh, sure.
Okay. I like what you said about belonging. Accessibility can mean, it's a big word, like you said, but also, I think about the ADA and the passage of, the significant umbrella of rights for people with disabilities. And accessibility, I do think starts with physical access, not starts with, but I think physical access is a massive thing, because without physical access, so many people are at home or in nursing homes or in places where we don't even know what our real community even consists of. And so I think physical access, social access, and then emotional access, there's all these different ways in which we build connection as human beings. And each one of them is important because each one of them prevents a whole other group of people from coming and being included. In the context of the work that we do with the Wayfaring Band, similar to Bridget, our community is folks, families who have people in their families with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes there's also a coexisting physical disability, not always. But so for us, accessibility is physical access, plus social access, plus food access, plus financial access. You can play this game forever, but at the end of the day, it does mean belonging. Because if I throw a physically accessible event and I say welcome a lot and try and make people feel, like that they're part of, but it's a gala and I charge $125 per plate, it doesn't matter how kind and welcoming I am, it's not ultimately accessible for people who can't afford the price ticket. So it isn't always my business, I don't think, to necessarily make every single experience accessible to every single person, because I don't know that that's possible. But I do want to ask the questions of who is going to have access if we do it this way, and who is not. And then we have to decide, can we live with that? If this is the choice that we're going to make, and these people are going to be left out, can we live with that?
And I do believe that accessibility is a process, it's not a destination. There's always more that we're learning. Early on after the ADA was passed, there was a lot of interest in physical access because everyone was afraid that the federal funds were going to get cut off if they didn't have a wheelchair ramp. And I thought that the transition from really doing a lot of work, technical assistance around that, to where we are today has been just fascinating because back then nobody was thinking about programmatic access. To me, a big issue is employment access. People with disabilities are still unemployed at a rate of 70% of this country. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I'd love to hear Nancy's thoughts about accessibility because I think the deaf community has a very interesting take on this.
Yes, so as a deaf individual, access is different. And as an artist, access means to be inclusive. It means to be equitable. It means to feel like a human and feel like I'm a part of. You know, we have rights as well. And it's important for deaf folks' communication access. The way lighting is situated makes things accessible or not, makes things feel friendly towards us or warm towards us. So that's what the deaf community sees. It's a very collective, tight-knit unit. It's very much has familial feelings. And so that's what access to me is.
I remember one of the first times I met Nancy, there was another artist who had done a painting, and the painting, the table was, it was really interesting for me to be in a room. It was mainly deaf people. It was very quiet, and he was explaining how the painting, there's a lot of wine glasses tipped over. He says, yeah, deaf people get very excited when things get spilled. And it was interesting to see 100 people in a room and not hear the hum of that many people because everyone was doing sign language. It was really an amazing thing. But I'm going to come back to Nancy just on this because I think the idea of who can access your work as an artist, because I've seen your art develop. I remember when we first met, you were doing a lot of landscapes, and we talked about your desire to go to Paris, and then you went to Paris. But now the work you're producing is radically different than, I think, those first landscapes. I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I think especially for a deaf artist or people in the deaf community, vibrant colors are really important. It draws the eye to the work much more so than maybe someone who's not deaf doesn't catch a lot of the things visually in artwork that a deaf person would. For me, being in a studio, for example, if somebody were to come in, obviously I can't hear them walk into the space. If somebody were to call me verbally, I couldn't hear that. So in thinking about how my attention is caught and thinking about, how, do I call Nancy? Even flickering the lights on and off. Or, sometimes I see a shadow. When I'm working, I'll see a shadow out of the corner of my eye. And I know that somebody's here and is coming up behind me. And a lot of it is very tactile, right? Coming up to me and getting my attention from behind by tapping me on the shoulder. The deaf community, we're big on hugging. We're big on being tactile, especially individuals who are deaf-blind. ASL becomes tactile, it becomes a feeling. And so I think that's something I could absolutely go on about. But I think those are some of the most important things that I see right now.
And I'm going to stick with Nancy for just a minute because I really want you to talk a little bit about that transition from the landscape paintings to more because you're primarily only using primary colors now. You're using a lot of the deaf imagery, and I'd love for people to learn a little bit about that because to me that's access for people that may not know about that.
Oh, yes. So at that time, I really hadn't developed an identity. I wasn't really sure what I needed to do. Like I thought, needing to be someone who speech reads and hears the best I could was important. Being deaf wasn't good. And I took a workshop called Deafhood. And that workshop really helped me to understand who I am as a deaf individual. Being someone who was born deaf, why, what does that disability and identity mean to me? A lot of deaf people don't see themselves as disabled, but we accept that we are. I accept that I'm disabled. I understand that. I know. And so the hands become really put. So you think about like the 5 senses, right? Taste, smell, touch, hearing. I've lost one of those senses, right? So I have 4 senses, not 5. So that handshake to me, that actually means deaf in Nepal. It means that is the sign for being deaf, because you only have 4 of the senses. But anyway, so at that time, I had always been painting landscapes, like you said, and just trying to explore what I wanted to do. The colors always seemed boring and muted to me, until the day I, really realized that yes, painting about my experience being deaf, painting about my being deaf, my experiences growing up, the way I navigated the world, the frustrations and oppressions that I faced, was something I could no longer hold inside. I had to show the world those feelings. And I wanted people to get to know that that is the experience of deaf folks, not just myself. So I grew up what's known as oral, going to a school that teaches how to speak and speech read. I never went to the school for the deaf, and so I was very much deprived of language growing up, because I was always focused on learning how to produce speech. And I learned really nothing about the world. There was no time for that. It was always focused on learning how to appear hearing. And so that's why I paint the way I do now, to show the vibrancy of my community, my identity. The primary colors, red, yellow, blue, I limit myself to those colors. Yeah.
And I think that that's a very amazing story, because, again, I've seen Nancy's progression, but I don't think a lot of people understand all of the symbolism in the art, and the reasons for the colors, and the use of the hands and art. So thank you for
There's a lot of symbolism.
There's a lot of symbolism, and it's just fascinating culture. Back to the idea of who can access the art. We were talking a little bit about access in terms of travel is sometimes very inaccessible. Some of the things that we might take for granted are very inaccessible. So I'd love to maybe hear from you guys a little bit more about who can access the art. How does access play out in that work?
Well,
She's like, okay.
I'm going to answer your question, but first I'm going to get a little feisty about something related. Because one of the things that I get a little bit fired up about is that even within our community, within the greater IDD community, so IDD being shorthand for intellectual and developmental disabilities, and within the greater IDD community, one thing that frustrates me is the ongoing infantilization of especially adults with disabilities. So treating adults like children from the time when they are children, but then never really having an opportunity to gain access to adulthood. And then that persists from the generation of parents and teachers and programs. And it's so widespread in the community that even I think a lot of the programs that are designed to, I would say the old school model of serving the community, that kind of top-down model, where the access is actually for the parents, not always the people with disabilities themselves. And so that's one of my kind of hot button issues is, again, back to the gala, creating these kind of like feel good, but in a pitying way, which I think we see in a lot of communities of people with disabilities of all varieties. This, the inspiration porn, which is a phrase that I did not coin and that Stella Young, who's the late disability activist, uses really well. But this idea that like, there's this sense that, oh, I'm gonna feel bad for you, and we're gonna take that and create access for able-bodied, neurotypical folks to have this sort of redemptive personal experience at the expense of people with disabilities. So when I'm thinking about access around art, it's very tied up in access also around how we move money around communities. So if I'm trying to fundraise, because again, I'm like Damon, a former executive director for a nonprofit, I have to think about money constantly, how to move money. But how I move that money is, if I unpack that, is actually symbolic for how I think about the community that I'm trying to be a part of. So I have to think, like, am I willing to sacrifice the dignity of the people that we're supposedly trying to uplift in order to create access for neurotypical people who are wanting a certain kind of experience? So I think about money a lot, and not because I love fundraising, but because I think it actually starts there. I can think about art, once I decide, for example, that at a fundraiser, I'm going to center the needs of the people in my community, so people with disabilities. When I center the needs of that community, and every other decision that we make is going to be radiating out like ripples in the pond from the original rock that we're gonna plop in the pond. Once we do that, then decision making can get really easy about access, and then it can be comfortable for me to leave people out. For example, the people who need to be recognized as the big corporate sponsor, it becomes easier for me to leave them out, because in order to serve their needs, I have to sacrifice the needs of our primary population. I know you wanted to talk about art.
No, actually, I'm good. That's not at all where I thought you were going. It's like, holy cow, I hope I didn't piss her off. Yeah.
Not you, the world.
Yeah.
The world pisses me off, not David.
Money is tied up to access. I mean, I'm going to go off script a little bit and talk about some of the things we deal with at the gallery, and then I'm going to come back and hear from our proponent. I don't want to leave Bridget out. One of the things at the core of Access Gallery's mission is increased economic opportunity for artists with disabilities. And we put them as artists first, and we deal with some of it. It's like, wow, all of that. But we realize that we're dealing with the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid systems that have not been overhauled or even looked at since 1972. So we're dealing with very bureaucratic structures that are not putting anybody, no individual, at the middle. It's about the bureaucracy, not about the individual. So I am hoping, and I do very much tie a lot of the hope that I find today very much to the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of the things that were going on over the last year or 2 years around this. We're not going to be quiet anymore. These systems are oppressive. We're not going to be doing that. We get the questions in the grants all the time. Well, how are you addressing diversity? I'm like, come for a visit and then ask me that question, because it's, to me, there's so many caveats to this. But I loved what you were talking about. We can come back to it.
We'll come back to art.
We'll come back to it.
There's always art.
Yeah. So, but Bridget, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I thought of something when you were kind of talking about the thought that is put on adults, specifically with IDD, that they are shy, that they are children. And I saw that a lot with my last job, and that is a lot, as an able-bodied person, teaching dance specifically. I didn't want to keep teaching dance in a way that was one, childish, but kind of just for fun and just to be happy and have a fun class once a week, because I think adults with IDD deserve more than that as artists. And with dance, I'll talk a little bit about my past year with Beam Plus and the classes we've been able to hold. because we've gone through some really deep emotions in class. And I think that's another thing, it's a big pet peeve of mine too, is that adults, specifically adults actually with Down syndrome, we have a large population of people with Down syndrome in our classes, are kind of always made out to be happy. These people are always happy, and nothing bad can ever happen. But we had like lots of crying, lots of like very emotional conversations, and when you give someone the space to just express anything they want to, it's absolutely beautiful. And we had our dancers be able to express the anger that they felt in isolation. All of their programs being canceled, pretty much them just kind of being thrown to the side. And luckily, you know, we weren't in person, but our classes on Zoom actually provided a whole new level of access because we had people from all over Colorado joining our classes that I would have never been able to meet, or people wouldn't have been able to join us otherwise. So that's also been really cool to be able to access people on Zoom, which like before COVID, I don't think I ever would have thought of doing dance classes on Zoom. But I think moving forward, we'll probably always have classes on Zoom as an option to keep those people with us and accessing our stuff.
And to that point, a lot of access tends to dovetail. So, you know, here you're talking about technological access, which aligns really well with the lack of transportation access in our community. You know, a lot of folks in our community don't drive and don't navigate the bus system or depend on caregivers to get them places. And so all of a sudden it was like this little technological thing of like, can we make this jump? And then the whole community, boom, like really, I mean, so then of course it's then internet access, right? And then it's device access. But so it just keeps kind of, it's beads on a string, you know, and it keeps going. But the more open and the more access we create, it's like, cool, now we're prepared to do this level and now this level, you know, or to get down to the root.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I just want to share something related to what you're talking about. I have taught workshops for deaf individuals, troubled deaf youth, and they're in schools. They have special projects in those schools, and they hire me to come and teach the deaf youth art in order to help them really express themselves and get those emotions out. And the reasoning behind that is schools feel very frustrated trying to get those students to communicate what their issues are, what issues they're facing at home. They want them to be able to share what the frustrations that they're feeling are, but the students refuse, and they keep all of that bottled up. So then they invite me to come, and I help them to really figure out how to express themselves and think about themselves as a deaf person and what they're seeing today, what's going on in their home life, in their families, whatever it is. I just focus on helping them open up, and then I teach them about colors and the meaning behind the primary colors, red meaning power, yellow meaning hope, and blue meaning oppression or autism. And we really get the students thinking, and then they make the work, and they're really able to express themselves in that way. I remember one student sharing their experience with bullying in school, and another one shared their experience about child molestation at home through their artwork. And really just that helps the counselors at school immensely. Just art as a form of therapy is so powerful.
And also, Nancy, it seems to me that what you're talking about is also a good example of the importance of having boundaries around certain communities, that accessibility doesn't mean all people in the room all the time, all doing the same thing. Because I think what I'm hearing from you is that part of why that was successful is because it didn't involve hearing kids, right? That there was like the continuity of the deaf community having a deaf-only space. And I'm a big fan of that. I think that that's really important to think about. When do we want to have identity-specific spaces? And then when are we trying to do more inclusive spaces that have the diversity of all of us with our many identities? And they're two different kinds of access.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
And you know, to sort of continue on that role, for me, the arts have always been I won't say a leveling playing field because that's not accurate, but art, creativity, the expression of oneself through art is something that is pretty universal. I think we all have that drive and that desire, and the more we can open that up to people that are historically marginalized, I think we can see some really, really amazing things. I know you've seen, you were talking about some of the things you've seen in the studio. I don't necessarily always take to the therapeutic angle, but I see the importance of that. I've seen that time and time and time again. So if we can talk a little bit about that wonderful magical thing that we call art or creativity in terms of this global idea of accessibility, because I think Nancy was explaining that very well. I think that those things, we all see those examples, we all live those examples. That has nothing to do with curb cuts or ramps, but some of that can't happen until there are curb cuts and ramps. So I don't know if there's a question in there. I don't know if I've mentioned it's been a day, but I'm going to let you guys sort of unpack that one a little bit. So.
You know, it kind of made me think about we've been able to have, I wouldn't say a therapeutic process mixed in with what I do, because I don't think of it as like therapy in any sense. But I've come at it from me not feeling like a staff. And I think from a lot of jobs I've had, I'm in a staff role and I have to cut off that like level of friendship from adults, and I've always hated that. And so with Beam, our classes, actually a lot of classes, I open it up to everyone, like who wants to lead this portion of class. I'm not the only one here leading. You guys all have something to contribute to this. And so each week we'd have someone lead a warm-up or lead an improv game. And the improv games were, I didn't know how they would go over at first, and we did them every single week because it took up probably 40 minutes of class. So it was the best part, because I wasn't telling people what to do the whole time. It was, let's all take this idea and make it our own, and the movement that stemmed from it was beautiful. And people's like ideas of new games that we could all try was really cool. So giving people those leadership opportunities also, I think is really important. I can't remember kind of where you started that conversation, but it made me think of that.
Yeah, well, I was really just talking about the idea of the importance of that creative outlet for pretty much everyone.
Yeah. So really people latched onto that chance to be able to lead and do their own thing.
Express themselves. Do you want to chime in on that, or should we?
Well, I was just thinking still about artist therapy, not just for children, but also for adults. Like the LGBTQ community, are helping them open up and helping them experience their identity through that. Also, the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, helping them to explore their identity. And I think that since BLM has started gaining more traction, that has really opened up a lot more therapeutic opportunities for people in those communities who are deaf, especially for women who experience intersectionality. Maybe, women who are also deaf, who are mothers, who are wives, who have many identities. Being able to express that through art, not just as part of therapy, but just as a form of expression. It's really been amazing. And it's very powerful. I think that we're seeing a lot of that happening too.
I think the idea of intersectionality just keeps coming up and coming up and coming up. And one size really doesn't fit all. It never really does. And I think that that's something that, if anything, the last year to 18 months has shown us is that one size doesn't fit all in terms of pretty much anything, but in terms of accessibility, in terms of inclusion, in terms of who really does get to sit at the table. I think hopefully those things are changing. I feel there's a lot of tension in the world trying to fight back on that. But I think the idea of art and creativity is so central to who we are as humans that I want to make sure that we're giving as many people the opportunity as possible.
Yeah, and one other thing I want to add to that, I guess, is that one of the things that I like about being an artist, so I'm also an artist myself, I'm a writer and a performer, and in the work we do with the Wayfaring Band, every trip that we take, we have an artist in residence on the trip with us, working in a different medium, and the artist gets to come on the trip on full scholarship, but then in exchange, they have to provide us with an ode to our adventure. So they have to write a song or make a film or tell a story. But that actually happens after. It's more of a tool that we use for reflection and for storytelling and to help spread out our storytelling so that if I'm the only person in charge of telling a story, then I get to add my lens to it, right? Everything that I'm saying has my imprint on it. But if we kind of let that storytelling go and spread it around to different people, we will learn about ourselves too from seeing the stories that are reflected back to us from the community. But the thing that's so cool too about the art is that it gets rid of this good-bad binary. Like the creativity is this one area where it's like, I can't be wrong. There's no chance that I can like totally F it up. It's like nobody's gonna be like, sorry, red buzzer. And that, like you said, it's not about leveling the playing field so much as just being like, okay, well, we can just all move into this space because there isn't a right or a wrong way to behave. And anything that, to me, like that's like the heart of access. And it's also really healing. I know living in a country and a culture where mainstream white American Western kind of thought is very concerned with whether we like it or not, right? Whether we agree or not. I think it's very concerned with right, wrong, strengths, weaknesses, top, bottom, all of these binaries. And art is a place where we can just cast that off and be in community.
Yeah. And I think it's so, I see that all the time and trying to encourage the young artists that we work with. It's not right or wrong. You're learning your way to express yourself. We have artists that are nonverbal that are really doing some very innovative and creative things because we're giving them or helping them identify as artists. And that's such a big, powerful tool when you've been told your whole life you're less than. Even the word disability connotates less than. The idea of dis is usually not followed by anything nice. Disability, disenfranchised, dislocated. There's a few things that the dissent I'm okay with, but this whole idea of less than, I think art can also bring some of that dichotomy to the forefront, and we can really challenge who is an artist. Well, you're an artist if you believe you're an artist. Even though your second grade teacher may not have really loved your painting of the purple tree, that's okay. That's a very different, that's a whole very different status. I have no idea how we're doing on time. Meredith, somebody, anybody? We're good? Okay. So I really wanted to go back to something that we touched on just real briefly. And Meredith, if you wouldn't mind giving me, like when we have like 10, 15 minutes, because I do want to ask the audience here in the studio for any questions or anything that they'd like clarification on. Folks at home, I guess you're going to have to zoom in on that. But I wanted to go back to this idea of innovation and accessibility and how things are changing. I mentioned earlier, way back when, there were people chaining themselves to the bus because they couldn't get on the bus. To me, that's pretty, that's like Saul Alinsky, let's just go, let's do some social disturbance. But I think that some of the things that we're seeing now, in addition to the technology that we're all been kind of forced to embrace over the last 18 months, I think there's other innovations that I'd love to sort of hear from you about innovation. Where do you see us going? I'm always more excited about where we're going than where we've been, but I see opportunities through both technology and just different mediums, different voices at the table. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts around innovation and accessibility.
I can speak a little bit to I feel like there's a lot of innovation happening in specifically the dance world, because I come from a background of very strict technique. There is a right and a wrong, and I hated it. And when it comes down to movement, there's no right or wrong way, and I think a lot of people don't try to make their way into dance because of that like stereotype. And so I've seen around the country too, and all of these companies that are starting up of inclusive dance, and people on their leadership and people in their on their boards that are diverse and that have disabilities and come from every single background. And that makes me excited because I think the dance world has needed that. It's been, the dance world is also extremely white. And so the inclusion of all of these people and thinking that movement is not just one technique, I see as a really cool innovation that's happening across the country and in Denver. It's exciting.
Any other thoughts on innovation?
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas sort of about innovation, but I see that not a whole lot of movement happening. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of motivation when it comes to innovation. There's a lot of talk. There's always a lot of talk. And I am dying for some movement on that. I feel like we're pretty behind. I mean, when it comes to technology, some cities already have certain things that they're offering while other cities do not, and I want to see more quality there. I'll give you an example. There's a museum, or there are some museums that offer, they have an accessibility statement on their public-facing information where people can see that they're accessible. Well, other museums, they don't have that yet. They don't offer that. Or what about hiring deaf people to work in those galleries to provide support and education for that museum? I mean, there's so much, but there's so little action. My passion, or my patience, excuse me, is getting pretty thin. I'm feeling frustrated on that front.
And I think rightfully so. We've known each other a very long time, and I've seen time and time again. And in fact, one of the reasons we opened the first version of Access Gallery is because we realized artists like Nancy weren't getting representation in the more traditional gallery sense. So we were really recognizing a long time ago that there is not a greater acceptance. And I think this goes a little bit back to what Bridget says. There are rules about who's an artist, who's able to show at a gallery or at a museum, and I hope that we can finally start breaking down some of those barriers. Very early on, we opened the gallery because artists didn't have any representation, and we realized that some artists have even less representation. So, but you know, one thing I noticed during the pandemic is we were all forced basically to use Zoom, and Zoom took forever to start offering captioning. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? It's great that you're free and accessible, but captioning is such a simple thing for them to do. And Google Meets was doing it pretty early on, but they sucked. I mean, it was just, Google Meets, I better be careful, I'm sorry. It just was, you know, it was just not a thing. So I think that, you know, I don't want to harp too much on technology, but I think there is innovation in that way. I remember early on, I would meet with Uzi, the artist that we were talking about earlier. I don't sign, I can get by with a little bit, but we would write notes back and forth, and then we started texting, and that was much easier. And a lot of people don't know the deaf community were one of the first people to really embrace texting, because that to me was an accessible innovation, but the rest of the world hasn't carried on. You know, we can really use that to our advantage, I think.
Also, I think that it would be really nice to see some type of label on the door, like out here in this gallery, some sticker on the door that says this is a deaf-friendly environment, which means that we'll provide interpreters here, or somebody here knows sign, or we have other accessibility devices here like speech-to-text translation. You know, there's so many different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, go please.
Well, I love what you're saying, Nancy, because, again, I'm going to be reliably feisty, but we have so many innovations already that people don't use, right? Like we've had the ability to put captions on every single video for a long time, and still a lot of folks aren't using that. We have the ability to do image descriptions or alt text, and it's so easy, and so many folks who don't actively need it themselves don't use the innovation that already does exist. And I think about, so then I start thinking about, okay, well, what's the social innovation that could be paired with that? And what gets me really excited is if I shift, okay, and this is in the Wayfaring Band, the way we talk about it is that we value inclusion. Easy to say. What's the practice? We practice hospitality. So by pairing inclusion with hospitality, that means it's on me to make you feel welcome. It's not on you to ask for an accommodation. It's on me to create an accommodating space, and then you can come if you want it, right? So we don't work with anyone in the deaf community, and all of our events have interpretation, because without that, the deaf community gets the message that they can't come, right? And it's not perfect, like we're learning constantly because, you know, we're in conversation with each other all the time. But so to me, I guess, what is an innovation, what I get really excited about is when I see people get fired up about hospitality and start taking some responsibility for just being like, I'm gonna try. It may not be perfect, but I am going to try, and I'm not gonna make it your job to ask. I am gonna just try, and then I'm gonna learn when I get something wrong. So like, for example, we had one woman, a blind woman, come to one of our events. We knew she had bought a ticket. So we were like, okay, we have a program that she is not gonna be able to interact with. We need a Braille alternative. So we Googled, you know, we don't have any other blind friends, and I'm not gonna make it her job to educate me. So we Googled, because we live in the time of Google, how lucky are we, you know? So we Googled it, and we ended up making this Braille, you know, we like got a cool thing, and we did a very simple job. You know, they have these cool things where you can print Braille, and with a ballpoint pen, pop it through the paper and make it tactile. So we made it, she loved it, and then she said, it was way too tiny to read. She said, you know, she was like, by the way, I can't tell you how good I feel, and I couldn't read it because it was too small. She's like, you know, there's a font thing, of course. Like, her fingers can't perceive, you know, the font if it's too small. So we learned something about like what else, how we can keep going, but it still built enough of a bond that now we can continue the conversation. And I think that's an innovation in itself. Like, some innovation isn't technological, it's human, it's social.
Yeah. And my hope in what I've seen and what again, little glimmers of hope. I can be a little feisty myself. Little glimmers of hope that people are asking different questions than they used to. We used to do presentations, and a lot of the questions from cultural organizations were, how do we deal with those people? And those questions, it's like, well, first you ask them, second of all, they're not those people, they are us. We are all the same people. But the questions now are a little bit different. You know, what about this? Is there a better way to do the alt text? Is there this happening, or is that happening? So I do feel a little bit of hope and encouragement, but I'm also a little bit like Nancy. It's like, I've been doing this work here around different disability communities since I was 13 years old. And it's amazing to me how much has changed, and it's also amazing to me how much has not changed. But I think that that shift away from that, I thought it was interesting that this is a wellness, or a place of wellness for creatives. I think art is part of that discussion that we too often forget, but it's not for them, it's for all of us. If we can't innovate things in the arts, then where is that innovation going to come? That was good. I don't know about that, but that whole idea of things do change and evolve. I'm a little bit encouraged to hear different questions. Do you want to have any closing thoughts about innovation?
I had one thought just from you guys talking about coming from working for a really large organization to now starting my own really small. I think that and some organizations are doing a great job of this, but everyone on the team, everyone involved is on board, is going to be true innovation, because if it's just one person, if it's just one department, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And your organization isn't going to be truly accessible. You have to have everyone on board, and everyone's going to bring a different perspective because everyone's doing something different. So I think that's where true innovation can happen too. You get everyone on board.
Innovation in human resources. The HR department has to innovate.
Yeah. I remember for a long time we were talking about the idea that there's a 70% unemployment rate for people with disabilities. And if you happen to be blind or on the autism spectrum, it's closer to 90%. And one thing I will say that the last 18 months has taught us is that people who are on the autism spectrum, people who are blind, people who have disabilities can and should be allowed to work from home as well. So a lot of the barriers around employment should be removed, and I think we need to have those conversations with the HR director, not just the accessibility coordinator.
Right, yeah.
Not just the, I used to really, it seems like a really small thing, but it seems also like a victory, so I'm going to share a story. When I would work with big institutions, I would always say if you're going to have chairs in your galleries for people to rest, that's a good thing. You want people to be able to rest. Standing up is not always easy for a lot of people, but if you don't have arms with chairs with arms on them, sometimes it's harder to get out of a chair if you have some mobility issues and pressing down. So people may not want to sit down if they don't feel that they can get back up. So those things, just thinking in terms of, okay, again, going back to that hospitality mentality, what can I do to make this more comfortable for you? And I have a Braille story. How are we doing on time? Are we doing okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, and just from the perspective of folks who might be bigger,
Yeah.
no chair, no handles.
No handles.
Want
So
low,
a little bit of
so
both.
you need
A little
everything.
bit of both.
Yeah, but that's access,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah,
like
it
you
is.
said it at the very first moment. You said what works for one person
Is
may
gonna
not
work
be
for
access for another,
Yeah.
and that's the only golden rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece of this is that if we're designing for the bulk of the people isn't, to me, enough. We need to be designing for all people. We need to really think it through a little bit. Because in the bell curve model, there's still people on the ends that we're not thinking about. But I was at a training in Boston many, many years ago, and talking about Braille. And I was in a training about how to make museums more accessible. It was a great training. It was a wonderful training. The Boston Museum, I believe it was Boston Museum of Science, I don't know the actual name. They were very proud of the fact that nothing went into one of their gallery spaces until everybody that would touch it had signed off on it. Everyone from the people that had to clean it, to the designers, to everything. It was everyone that had anything remotely to do had to sign off on anything that went into the galleries, including the accessibility people and all of that. And there was this one gallery at the end that was universally designed. It was supposed to be very accessible for anyone that would come in. And it was about the 7 temperate zones of the New England area. Very cool, sciencey type of thing. And this big, beautiful bronze of an egret or some kind of waterfowl. It was a big bird, but it was bronze. And we were looking at it, and they said, we made the decision not to put a Braille label on this because Braille is a dying language. Less than 10% of blind people. No, these are the people. This was a long time ago. I think they fixed it because there's a moral to the story. So they decided not to put a Braille tag on their most accessible. And I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, really, I think we need to go back a little bit. Right then and there, 2 blind people walked in.
Yes.
They could feel the sculpture, but they wanted the Braille labels. And I'm just like, okay. So maybe sometimes we should have asked before we assumed that this wasn't necessary. And I know they did go back and put the Braille label on, but it was amazing to be there and just realize how one more step would have made that so much easier, so much better, especially when you're touting how inclusive this particular space is. But I think I'd like to end, or come closer to the end, just asking everyone on the panel, what do you want anyone or everyone listening to take away from this discussion? Bridget, so we're going to go back where we started. Take it back to.
Let's see, we just talked about so much. I think from my work, I would like to kind of give people, go to your community when you have questions. Find people that are doing the work. Find people to highlight that are doing the work that are diverse. Don't always rely on yourself and your knowledge. I think throughout my career and everything I've done, Andrea and Damon and plenty of other people have been really great resources and connections for me in learning, and a lot of going to disabled folks and talking. So I think that's kind of what I want to give to everyone. Just go talk to people, make those connections.
Me?
Yes, you.
I'm picturing the able-bodied neurotypical artist or arts administrator, actually, who may see the whole concept as a chore. And I would like to say that, we spend so much time talking about listen, and there's some chastising involved with accessibility and diversity and blah, 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 blah. First of all, it's such a privilege to be able to be a little bit annoyed about having to create access like that. If that's your point of view, then that's a bummer, and check yourself. And so it's the question of what's the reward? Collective liberation is the reward. When I think about what we stand to gain, what we can gain from, you said belonging at the beginning, which to me is that's what it's for. It's because I want to be a part of a vastly interesting, celebratory, diverse, innovative, artistic community. I want to be a part of that community. I want to be a global citizen. And so it's not just disability. It's, starting to think around accessibility then extends to gender and race and religion and culture and language access and all of these other things that at the end of the day is about getting to participate as just one other person in this great global community where I want to do it I just want it to be as interesting as it can possibly be. And so that's the reward, that's what we gain if we do this.
Now, when you leave this space, when you walk out that door, I want you to remember the message that one size does not fit all.
Since I've inserted myself in the panel, even though I'm supposed to be moderating, it's kind of like herding cats. There's a couple things that I always try and leave people with. The idea that if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. One size most certainly does not fit all. We really have to stop thinking of disability as something to be fixed and just something to be. It is just part of life. If you live long enough, if you're lucky to live long enough, you will experience disabling conditions. I've said this a couple different times. I think the other convergence around accessibility and thinking in terms of how we approach people is going to be happening because people are living longer. And the things that we will not accept as we get older will push innovation and accessibility in ways that no legislation, no protest, chaining yourself to the bus will not. It's when it starts happening to the millions of people that are going to be living to 100 that we might see some different things. And I really hope that we take the time to learn from the people that have already been there in the trenches for a very, very long time. I love what Bridget said. If you want to learn about somebody with a disability, talk to people with disabilities. Don't make assumptions about who reads Braille until you talk to somebody who reads Braille. It was just a fascinating thing. So I would love to hear any questions, any thoughts, anything that people might want to go a little bit deeper in. Are we doing okay with we're good? Okay.
Hot seat.
Come on. I'll start picking on people, but I don't want to do that. I want people to be comfortable. Because we can keep going too.
I have a question.
You can read it.
Thinking sort of on a higher systemic level, how can artists and people arts adjacent really advocate for this kind of change? Sort of thinking on maybe a policy level, what opportunity might be there? Because I think artists have such a powerful voice, and I would love to see them be elevated to be advocates. And I think this is could be such a natural way for them to plug in and make change.
Well, I'm fairly certain all of us have an opinion about that. So where do we want to start? You want to start with that, Nancy?
Oh, sure. You're absolutely correct in that artists have that powerful voice. I've done several murals, several graffiti murals that show that advocacy side of it. And I think that's the important piece, right? I think more people need to do that, to do it through their art. And I'll let Andrea and Bridget speak to how they would like to see that done.
I could say, going back to the money, it's just like, I don't want to hear money as the excuse for not having interpretation, for not choosing a wheelchair accessible space. You know, to me, there's no excuse. Those have to be mandates. So I think artists can demand wheelchair accessible.
It's a tax write-off, folks. It's a tax write-off.
Yeah, you know, and it's like, so as an artist, I can also, if I'm a visual artist installing in a gallery, I can't rely on the gallery owner to be thinking about an accessible community. So I can say, do we want children in this space? If so, do we want to move any of the installations down? Or people who are wheelchair users, you know, are not going to be, like, even this is a good example of an inclusive installation to me, right? That we've got one painting that's a little bit lower and one that's higher, and this says to me that I can be any height and I can engage with this work, right? But you go in a lot of galleries that are just for standing adults. So as an artist, those are specific things that I can help, and it can be a creative conversation. That could be really fun. You know, to me, it doesn't always have to be a bummer. It's like, who do we want to come in here? You know, and then do we want some visual aids? You know, do we want, I think about it a lot of times even, you know, now it's very popular at restaurants, especially with COVID, to have just a QR code that you scan to get the menu, which is really inaccessible to a lot of people in our community. And so this is not the artist answer, Meredith, but like as a human being, when I go into a restaurant and I see that, I'll ask for a paper menu, and I'll suggest to the manager, hey, you might want to just have a few on hand, just have a few for those of us who like need to hold something in our hands, you know. And sometimes people just need the feedback. So I think, yeah, having conversations, opening our mouths, engaging in dialogue, and yeah, and then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to you really, but I just like, I'm exhausted by cancel culture. I know I'm not the only one. And I'm like, I consider myself to be a lifelong activist. I'm not gonna get burned out. You know, it's too important. And how can we increase our endurance to be able to keep showing up for fights that will not get finished in our lifetime? And so if I can't bring some joy, some humor, and some collaboration into that space, I am the one who is going to be harmed and is going to have to exit that space. So I'm also looking for that. Like, how can I bring someone along next to me and that we're facing it together and we're like, what do we think about this? Instead of, I'm against you and you're the opponent. So how can we be like, how can we do this? So yeah.
Yeah, going off of that, kind of the collaborative aspect, having someone next to me. I've never been really like a solo artist. I'm big on collaboration. And I think representation too. And so a lot of stuff that I've been asked to do the past couple of years, I've taken a back seat because I don't want just me to represent being a white, able-bodied person. So getting other people in the space and highlighting them instead of the typical white, able-bodied person. So I think that's been a lot of my advocacy work, has been taking a backseat on those things, bringing people that maybe I never would have worked with before, and highlighting them and getting them on my table and doing the fight with them, and highlighting them. That's kind of where I've come from recently.
And one more thing, sorry. So I tried to say no to being on this panel twice. The first time I was invited to be on the panel, I said, how many people with disabilities have you asked? And then they went back. And the second time I said, what's your racial breakdown? And then they went back. And there are some other factors, about who, how, and why, and there were various other people invited and blah, blah, blah. There was a whole process. And there were conversations that allowed it to feel like, yeah, I'm gonna say yes. But it is important to notice that another part of advocacy is sometimes saying no, not saying yes. So it's true that we have at least 3 folks who identify as white, and it sounds like, Nancy, that you are Native. And, there are a lot of other identities that aren't on the panel, right? And there are 3 folks who identify as, who are not people with disabilities on a panel about disability and accessibility. So, just to say that out loud, so there are a lot of voices that we're not hearing. And then, just to that point too, it's so I was recently asked to be on a board, about more like 16 months ago or something, like 18 months ago. But, and then it was a question of let me ask questions. So as an artist, I'm asked to sit on a board, I'm asked to participate in an event, I'm asked to do it. And as someone trying to build a career, there's so much pressure as an artist to be do the thing, get the credit. But if I really want to think about how to advocate systemically, I have to think, what am I going to be able to contribute at a systemic level to that? And is there a way that rather than even just saying no, can I uplift 3 other people who I would like to see instead? And that can be a powerful tool as well.
I think one of the things that society might, clearly, I've said this 3 times, so it must be important to me, we have to come back to 70% unemployment rate. If we have jobs that are open, we really need to consider hiring people with disabilities, particularly if we can have people with disabilities on the stage. For a long time, the accessibility fight was about, we need to get people with disabilities into the theater. And that's the wrong fight. If they can't afford the ticket, it doesn't matter. It really just does not matter. So to me, the big issue, probably the journey for the foreseeable future will be employment for people with disabilities, getting people with disabilities visible. We have a mural commission. I'm so excited. I didn't think we did it, but we did. We're doing a mural, and our criteria was we're going to do a mural of a person living with a disability as our artwork. Now, we ended up in a district that we are not located in, but we're going to go for it anyway. We'll figure it out. So we're trying to talk about who's the most likely person to put on this mural. But more than likely it will be a person in a wheelchair, even though people with wheelchairs are not the majority of people with disabilities in this country. They're often the most identifiable. So hire people with disabilities, depict, show people, be present with people with disabilities, hire artists with disabilities, to be on stage, to be on the gallery walls, to do the thing. It's again, that intersectionality. We can't just define somebody by one thing. So there are many, many, many things.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea.
And if you're an employer and your answer to that is, I would love to hire someone with a disability, but nobody with a disability ever applies for the position. First of all, I'd like to see your job description,
Yes.
right? And I'd like to know, do you have accessible events?
Yeah.
Do you have interpreters? Do you use captions on your videos? How's your social media?
Yeah.
Because you may say that you want that, but if you don't show that as part of your hospitality, I don't believe you. Because I don't believe that a person with a disability would be safe in an environment that doesn't know how to create access before they go to the hiring table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, during the pandemic we were talking a lot about jobs and job descriptions, and I kept seeing these job descriptions that said must be able to lift like 20 pounds. I'm like, why? Why do you need to lift 20 pounds? What is it that we're lifting that weighs 20 pounds?
Sit down, relax.
Yeah, it's okay. So, but some of this armature is just left over. We always put that in. We've always put that in. What if somebody gets hurt? I'm like, it's 20 pounds, and if they can't lift it, do you really want to preclude somebody that might have all the skills that you need? Or can somebody else pick it up for them? I mean, but again, depicting people, hiring people, asking people to be on panels, asking people to be in the room, not looking for something to fix. I think that's really, really important. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
I wanted to say, as somebody coming from the community, thrilled to see Nancy on the panel, see her story, listening to all of your stories has been amazing. And this has been such an important piece. I would love to see things like this continue and events be accessible like this for folks.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, I guess I could jump off of that. I think it's really great just having the conversations because it's such a vast undertaking and so important that I think just being aware is really helpful because some of you had spoke about like technology that we have that we don't currently use and what new technology can we implement. So I think just collaborating and talking about it is really helpful. And because you were talking about Braille, it just made me think of an article. And I'm sorry, I can't remember where I saw it or who shared it with me, but it was really beautiful because I've been to the Grand Canyon and, you know, we're talking about like the ramp to get up to the sidewalk and handrails to participate in seeing this huge wonder of the world. And just recently somebody occurred to them, well, on the handrail, why don't you put Braille describing what you're actually looking at to take that like one step further. And it seemed like such a simple solution, but really a powerful one.
There is actually a company, and I don't recall the name, that does put Braille on the bottom of handrails. And usually you'll see them in medical complexes, but there is a company that's doing that. So if we can get that type of thing out further. Thank you. Anyone else? No? Are we good? All right, well, I would like to thank everyone for joining the panel. Yes, I remember Andrea and I talked about, okay, who's on the panel, and Meredith reached out, I gave her some names, some people weren't available, but I was thrilled that my friend Nancy could come down. I haven't seen Nancy for a long time. Of course. I have a painting of the Eiffel Tower that Nancy did for my daughter who lived in France for a while, so Nancy and I go way back. I remember being with Bridget at the LEAD conference that was here, and the Kennedy Center hosted a big accessibility conference. Well, they haven't since the pandemic, but the last one was here in Denver, and we hosted a workshop about words and language, and I think words and language are also part of the accessibility. I always love to hear my friend Andrea talk, because I'm like, you said that really well, I just want to record you. But I remember that room was just overwhelming with people wanting this information. So I do believe the conversations are here and happening. I just want to leave you with this. I saw a picture of one of our artists, Jocelyn, who's on the trip with the Wayfaring Band right now, and I'm like, of course she's front and center on the photographs. So I would like to thank again CBCA for hosting this, for Converge for having us here. I haven't been here since the last time I think I visited you a couple of years ago. It's nice to be back out. One thing I will say about technology, Zoom has been a godsend in many ways. There's been some advantages, but to me there's still nothing like being in person. We were talking about whether we want to continue some of our Zoom classes, and we are going to continue some of them, but we're finding that some of our artists that have been so isolated for so long are really thriving now being back in presence of other people. So let's all keep our fingers crossed that the variant dies down and then we can all be back together in many more locations. So, and I'm so glad the library's back open. Nice to see you. Yay for library. So. All right, well, thank you all so
thank you,
much.
Damon.
Thank you.